This is the most expensive ITX case that I've ever reviewed at $500 US. Once you add in the few necessary options, that's what it comes out to. And surprisingly, it's one that you guys have been absolutely begging me to check out, and it's called the Winter One. And it promises both the best build quality and the best airflow that you can get from a space-optimized ITX case. Essentially, if you're building a custom water-cooled PC with an RTX 3090 and 2 radiators and sparing absolutely no expense along the way, this might be something that you're actually interested in. So let's get this thing built up and see if in any world there is a way to possibly justify that price. So unboxing the Winter One, this might surprise some of you, but you do actually have to assemble the case first, just like with the Form T1, for those of you who are familiar with that case. All of the parts do come flat packed and stored individually, but there are two main reasons for this. For one, it helps lower the price of the final product and the shipping cost, and also because building in the Winter One, you would need to disassemble most of the case first anyway. And just like the T1, assembling the case is super rewarding because the parts that you're working with here are unbelievably high quality. I mean, it truly is seriously insane for a PC case and easily up there with the best. All of the panels are anodized and sandblasted aluminium, which leaves a super premium finish, kind of like an Apple MacBook, and the machining too here is absolutely flawless, at least on this review sample. The power button here too is pretty cool and uses a Kailh box switch for some extra tactility. And so the build quality of this case is borderline obsessive, I'll say. It's really good, machine work is super solid, but the airflow design is what has me most interested because that as well has been kind of approached in the most optimal way. So we've seen with previous sandwich layout cases like this, where you have the spine in the middle and you've got your two separate compartments, that negative pressure is what works the best. That means pulling air out of the case and then kind of encouraging air through the side panels to your components. So if you're using an air-cooled build, for example, that means that you'll have the freshest air coming through the side panels and kind of leading to the best temperatures for your graphics card and CPU cooler. But also if you're using a liquid-cooled build, it's really important too, because that means that both radiators get the kind of cleanest, freshest air, and they're not passing hot air from one to the other. The cutouts in the panels as well for airflow are huge compared to your typical PC case, which I can see a lot of people actually not liking visually, but they do offer much less restriction. If you're not interested in these perforated side panels, you do have the option to go with solid ones instead, and there you do save a few bucks, but for a high performance system, I would recommend going for the fully perforated ones. They do look super interesting as well. I do like the look of them personally, but just be warned, they do reveal a lot of your interior components. In the end, we're left with a super high quality 15.5 liter case that's a bit bigger than the NCase M1 and a bit smaller than the NR200, but costs more than these two cases put together. At this size, it's pretty much perfect for a high performance desktop ITX PC, but definitely not something that I recommend traveling around with. Now, building the case up, I did unfortunately find a couple of imperfections that are worth noting. Firstly, one of the side panels was actually somehow bent and didn't line up with the top panel at all, which really at any price point is something that's worth noting, but for a $500 case, it's just straight up offensive. I did manage to straighten it out with a bit of manual force, which no user should have to do, but it is what it is, and now with the panel straight, it is actually somehow a bit loose, which means that you do get this annoying rattle. Also, the anodizing on the side panels is lighter and more matte compared to the rest of the case, which can be a bit jarring in certain lighting, and same with the rear bracket that secures the graphics card. Anodizing is always a really challenging thing for these cases, and it's really hard to get it consistent across all panels, but for a $500 case, I would expect this to be consistent. Alright, but enough talk about the shell of the case and the build quality, let's take a look at what you can actually fit inside here. And I think the most important thing to point out for the Winter One is that it's mostly optimized around a complete liquid cooling loop, that is a full custom water-cooled build. Sure, you can do an air-cooled build or an AIO build like this with an air-cooled graphics card, but at that point there is a bit of volume at the bottom of the case that does go to waste because you don't have a bottom radiator, and let's be real, the only way that you can really justify the price of this case is with a really high-end, fully water-cooled system. Now, for whatever reason, if you do want to stick an air-cooled graphics card in the Winter One, you can fit up to an RTX 3090 Fe in here if you're just going with top-mounted fans and not a radiator, and CPU cooler height tops out at 70mm, allowing you to run a Noctua NHL12S. And then for AIOs and liquid cooling, 240 or 280 mil rads can be installed at the top and bottom with a total of 57 mils of clearance to play with. So your typical 30 mil thick radiator paired with your standard 25 mil thick fans do make for a really close fit. Just make sure that you also double check the width and length of the radiators that you're planning on using though, because many will actually be too big. As for actually building in the Winter One, it's easy enough, but still a far cry from something like an N-Case or an NR200, where you basically just open up the side panel, drop in your hardware, and call it a day. To start with, the built-in I/O shield on my motherboard was somehow preventing the standoffs from lining up correctly, so I had to remove that before getting the board fully installed. Secondly, the power switch cables are way too short. Luckily, I didn't have a problem with them here, but plenty of other boards definitely will. Then, getting the GPU riser cable to properly clear the top-mounted fans on the AIO was a bit more challenging than I've seen in other cases, and graphics card mounting itself is just barely adequate. It has a lot more play than I'd like. The final fit and finish of the case as well is something that I'll just re-mention, with the front and rear panel not completely lining up with the top panel, which is a bit disappointing. And for those wondering, it was actually like this before installing any hardware. Now, although this is primarily a custom loop focused case, let's take a look at what the thermal performance of our test system looks like here against other ITX cases. Not surprisingly, the Winter One is towards the top of the stack with some very cool performance, under a 70-degree average here for our overclocked 10900K. It's only beaten by the SUPT Meshlicious when that case is running a positive pressure setup and intaking air from the front, but when it's also running a negative pressure setup, which is better for the GPU, like the Winter One, that's where the Winter One can beat it by a single degree. This makes it about 2 degrees cooler than the NR200 and about 8 degrees cooler than the N-Case M1. GPU thermals for the RTX 3080 FE are also very strong, especially for a sandwich style case, tying the thermal and noise performance that you'd get from one of the highest airflow mid towers that you can get on the market, the Phanteks P500A. It is beaten here by the NR200 by 1 degree, but considering the difference in noise level, I'd say that overall performance here is about equal. So overall thermals here are pretty good. I think most of us expected that, but the true thermal capacity of this case isn't fully realized until you go ahead and build a custom loop with 2 radiators along with some serious hardware. At that point, you're almost certainly going to exceed what you can do in an N-Case M1 or a Meshlicious or an NR200, but to the credit of those cases, they are significantly cheaper and are in no way limiting in terms of thermals. Not to mention, they also aren't covered in massive holes from front to back to achieve that kind of thermal performance, and this way they can kind of disguise the interior of your system a little bit better. To be completely honest with you guys, I'm not sure if I will actually get around to building a custom loop in this case, because this AIO based build was tedious enough, and I really don't know how many of you actually care about a custom loop in this case, because it is really expensive. And that's the other thing, for that price, I was just left a little bit frustrated with certain aspects of it. At that price, it should definitely not have mismatched or misaligned panels, but here we have both. My top ITX case recommendations are still the N-Case M1, the NR200, and the SUPT Meshlicious. Those cases are much easier to build in, less than half the price, and you won't need to wait around till the end of the year to actually get them. Technically, you can get the pricing of the Winter One down to $389 US with no options, but with just a 3.0 riser and solid panels, it's almost an even harder sell in my opinion. So to the small team behind the Winter One, what you have here is a really good starting point. The machining and the anodizing for 99% of the case is really good and some of the best that I've ever seen. But I can really tell that this is your first PC case. Some of the work here that just, like the GPU not fitting and the side panels not aligning properly, that stuff really needs to be perfect for an upwards of a $500 US PC case. And the pricing isn't even the biggest problem here, because I know plenty of people who are, putting an RTX 3090 and a 5900X and liquid cooling it in a case like this, and they are more than fine to pay that kind of money for their high-end system. But again, for that price, the case really needs to be perfect. So I think that's where we'll personally leave the Winter One. For those interested, I will leave links down below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down there as well. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.